Brendan Dassey Trial Transcript, Day 8, page 49. On the Wechsler abbreviated scale of intelligence, 90 people out of 100, 90 adolescents in his own age group would have performed intellectually better than he. Now I'm going to ask you in regards to the Kaufman test. Yes, sir. And again, these are both, for the lack of a better term, an IQ test. True. In regards to the Kaufman test, what results did you formulate when you provided the test to Brendan? He had a composite, an overall IQ compound score, overall IQ score of 83, which is at the 13th percentile. And again, what significance does that percentile have in your evaluation of Brendan? It shows that he has intellectual shortcomings to the point that 87 adolescents his age would have performed better on that test than he did. Why perform 2 intelligence tests on Brendan? This is an important case. I wanted to be thorough. I wanted to do it right. Were the 2 results consistent? Yes. What I mean by that, I suppose, be more specific, consistent with each other? True. And previously you mentioned you were performing a number of tests in order to determine, for one, whether or not your results were consistent throughout the tests. Was this test results consistent with other observations or the other observations from the other tests? Not necessarily. I could say that an individual with lower IQ might be more likely to be more passive, more uninvolved, but sometimes individuals with lower IQ don't want to be embarrassed about their low IQ and act out and cause trouble, so that their low IQ isn't seen to others, and so they're not exposed. So I really can't say it's related. So now you're not saying then that a person with a low IQ is necessarily suggestible, correct? Sometimes, with an extremely low IQ score, that could be a very significant factor, but usually a person would still administer an entire battery. So one test in and of itself wouldn't be enough for you to make an opinion on whether a person is vulnerable to suggestion. It wouldn't be enough for me, and I don't think it would be enough for the majority of forensic psychologists who are experienced in assisting the court and juries. Would the IQ test in and of itself be enough for you in making that determination? In this case, yes. No. Did you perform any other tests in relation to your evaluation of Brendan Dassey? Yes, I did. And what test was that? That was the Gudjonsson Suggestibility Scales. The reason it's plural is there are 2 scales. 2 scales that haven't been normed to the degree that they're helpful in this particular kind of hearing. 2 have been normed to the point where they're alternate forms. So you could give one form to a person one week and another form to a person another week, and they're just alternate forms and we'll get the same results. Can you briefly describe this test? Yes, it was constructed, like I said, by Gudjonsson in the early 80s to deal with interrogative suggestibility. Rather than define that, which is a lot of words, and I don't think it would be that helpful, I would just say that there are 2 aspects of interrogative suggestibility. Suggestibility when a person is being interrogated, and that's what it assesses. And there are 2 aspects. One is yield and one is shift. Could you describe or define what is yield in the Gudjonsson Suggestible Scale? Yield is when a person provides a response to a leading question, provides a response to a leading question which is not facts that have been presented to them. They don't know about that, or it's an incorrect statement. What is shift under the Gudjonsson Suggestibility Scale? Well, shift, the individual is presented a memory test, and they're read a crime scene, and then they're asked to repeat it. Then later on, it could be immediately, or later on up to half hour or 45 minutes, you ask the questions again, or you ask questions based on that, on the story, and you see whether they answer in a yes fashion to leading questions. Then after that is done, then you exert mild pressure or mild criticism to them by saying, I could pull out the exact... No, that's okay. If you can just recall from your memory, But it's something to the point where subject, you have made a number of errors. I know you can do better. I need you to think about this more carefully. And I'm going to ask you the same questions, and I want you to do better this time. And then the shift is the degree to the number of times that a person changes their answer from the first time their question, to the second time they're questioned with the very same questions. Now I have on the screen Exhibit 230. Is this the results that you received when you performed the Gudjonsson Suggestibility Scale on Brendan? Yes. And if you could just, you've already defined shift and yield. If you could indicate the significance of the other three categories, score, percentile, and average. Sure. On the yield, which should be at it's the first set of 25 questions that are asked. 5 questions are related. They're just neutral questions. So they're but on the yield, 15 questions are yield questions, and he answered in a yielding fashion in terms of leading questions 7 times. On the shift, he changed his answers 9 times out of 20 potential answers. And then the average individual taking the test would yield to leading questions 4 times out of 15, and 2 times they would change their answers when they were read the questions again, 2 times out of 20 of the questions that are designed to measure that. So the difference here is 2 and 9 and 4 and 7, resulting in a percentile score that individuals taking that test, only 3 out of 100 would shift their answers more than Brendan did, and only 20 out of 100 would yield their questions to give in and go along with leading questions more than Brendan. So he had a greater tendency to shift his answers due to pressure than he did simply answer them when there were leading questions without pressure. The way you get the total score is you add up the shift and the yield to get a total score of 16. And so the average person would get a score of 7. And the percentile for the total of these two for the total score would be 95. 5 people out of 100 would obtain more yielding and shifting responses than did he. 95 would not. Was this the last test that you performed or conducted on Brendan in regards to your evaluation as to whether he was vulnerable to suggestion? Yes. And based upon these results and the mental status examination, as well as other collateral information, were you able to reach an opinion as to whether or not Brendan is a person who is vulnerable to suggestion? Yes. Is that opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty? Yes. And what is that opinion you have? It's my opinion that he's highly suggestible when being interrogated, in responding to leading questions or pressure, mild pressure if that in fact is present. Is that your opinion based solely on the Gudjonsson Suggestibility Scale or a combination of the other tests, the series of tests that you performed on Brendan? It's based on my knowledge of the research, based on the collateral data that we've talked about. It's based on all of the personality tests that I used and IQ tests that I used, and it's also based on the Gudjonsson scale. Would it be, as a forensic psychologist, would it be appropriate to consider just one test that was performed in isolation from the others? It would not be recommended practice, even if a person had a substantially low IQ. Like I said at the very beginning of my testimony, these are important matters that I testified before, and forensic psychologists testify about, and to not do a thorough job and to do anything less than that wouldn't be right, both ethically and by my own standards. You had indicated before that you've performed similar evaluations on approximately 5 other instances. At least that, yes. Did you perform the exact same tests in each circumstance? No. So some of the tests performed on Brendan you may not have used on others, either because I did not possess them or because I acquired further information from seminars and from my review of the literature that indicated that other tests might be more helpful to use as well. Is the Gudjonsson Suggestibility Scale consistent within your evaluations? I did not use it on one, at least one that I can think of. I didn't have it at that point, It was difficult to obtain. You have to order it through New York and submit your credentials via internet to London, and it's a unwielding process. But finally, I did succeed. It took me about a year to get the test once I decided I wanted it. It should be made much. I shouldn't give an editorial. In reaching your conclusion, your opinion, were there any other factors that you considered more probative than other factors in assessing Brendan's vulnerability to suggestion? No. Not in this case. Let me clarify your answer as, would it be consistent then that you consider all factors probative? Yes, and I wouldn't be able to assign a percentage. Do you recall what factors that you considered when you reached your conclusion as to Brendan's level of vulnerability to suggestion? I considered all that I testified to, plus the way in which the detective asked the questions, and that's pretty much it. Now, the length of time he was in custody, the soft room that he was in, that made him more relaxed and comfortable to talk. Let me ask you this. Are those factors that, in the research by Gudjonsson, is something to consider when assessing a person's vulnerability to suggestion? Yes. And you touched upon a few. In fact, when I asked you to elaborate, you touched upon what I believe Gudjonsson refers to as circumstances of custody. Do you recall that? Touched upon duration and... Sure. Why did... what significance does duration of custody have in assessing an individual's level of susceptibility to suggestion? The longer they're in custody, the more anxious they probably become, the more fatigued they become, and the more susceptible they become to offering a confession, whether it be false or true, just to offering a confession when they otherwise might not have. Are you familiar with the length of custody in regards to Brendan in regards to the statement made on May 1, 2006? Attorney Kratz: Judge, if I may interpose an objection, I think custody is a legal term. If that could be expressed in some other way, I'd appreciate that. The court: Well, Attorney Freeman, that's fine. I'll rephrase. That's fine, Judge. Attorney Freeman: The duration of the interview process, you understand what I'm asking you, Doctor? Yes. How long he was there with the officers? I believe it was in the neighborhood of 4 hours on at least one occasion. But approximately, you believe it was around 4 hours? Yes. Does the length of the police presence, and that I shall try to define better, the length of time that the individual is with the police, is that a factor under Gudjonsson's research to consider in assessing a person's level of suggestibility? Yes. And are you familiar with how long the police had been involved with Brendan prior to making the March 1, 2006 statement? I don't know for sure, but I think it was at least several days. That I don't have committed to memory. Again, in regards to the Gudjonsson research, what other factors does the Gudjonsson suggest to, for lack of a better term, that forensic psychologists or persons performing evaluations consider as a factor in pertaining to their opinions about suggestibility? Sleep deprivation, well, let's go through each one. Was that a consideration in this case? No. Okay. Another is the way in which the interrogation was conducted. Is that something that you considered, again, in reaching your conclusion in this case? Yes, I reviewed the written data as well as reviewed the CDs. And in that regard, are you referring specifically to this issue of yield and shift from the scale? Yes, and I'll get back to that. What other factors does Gudjonsson recommend using by the evaluator? Well, considering whether promises were made, whether a person was told that the case was an absolute certainty, that they would be found guilty, whether they were told that there was other information that showed their guilt when it did not, was not present, when they appealed to different themes such as we know you really didn't, minimizing the serious, we know you really didn't mean to do this, or we know you weren't really an active participant, or we know you wouldn't have done this. Now, if you had it to do over again, or your family will be spared a lot, there are all kinds of different themes that can be developed by an interrogator to increase the likelihood of that occurring. And then as the person generally weakens and becomes fatigued, there is a greater chance that they will then give a statement. The likelihood of retraction is very great in cases like this, when this is a confession. That's why it's important to consider whether a written statement was derived from it. Let me get back to, I'll have some specific questions for you, but let me get back to, you were talking about techniques or interrogation style. Now, again, if I recall correctly, this has something to do with yield and shift, correct? That's true.